I want to open up today's video by letting you in on a little secret. Come closer. I'm not always shooting in manual mode anymore. I know! Shocking, right? Well, brace yourself, because I'm not the only one. You see, a lot of pro photographers are not always shooting in the manual mode, and some don't want you to know that. Now, when you start out in photography, you're always told that if you want to be pro, then you must always shoot in manual mode. I was told the same thing, and for years that's all I ever did, and that's all I ever told other people to do. Which is something I kind of feel guilty about, but in my defense, I still think it's a fundamental skill to fully understand and master the exposure triangle, as I do think it makes you a better photographer. But it's also vitally important once you have to understand where and when you should use manual mode, because not all shooting scenarios demand that you be in manual mode. In fact, in some shooting scenarios, it can actually be a detriment, like with street photography. There have been countless scenarios when I've been doing street photography and using full manual mode where I have missed shots because I've had to fumble about with all the camera settings, dial everything in before I can even think about hitting the shutter button, and by the time I'm ready to hit it, the moment's already passed. So it's important to remember, as a photographer, your priority is to capture the subject. No one's going to care if it was captured in a manual or a semi-auto mode. As long as you got the shot, that's all that counts. Now, for those unfamiliar, a semi-auto mode allows you to choose one important setting and then the camera will handle the rest. So aperture priority is the preferred semi-auto mode by most, if not any, photographer, beginner or professional. And that's because it's the creative tweak that has the biggest scope in changing the final look in our images, doing so by adjusting how much background blur is in our photographs. Entering this mode is really straightforward. On Canon it's labelled as AV, and most other cameras like Sony it's labelled A. Once in aperture priority mode, the camera simply allows you to choose the f-stop value. From there, the camera is going to automatically adjust the shutter speed to achieve a balanced exposure. Now that's just the bare bones essential to aperture priority, but to really get the most out of it, we need to dial in some adjustments first to really unlock its full potential. These adjustments include auto ISO, minimum shutter speed, exposure compensation, and metering mode. And in today's video, I'm going to share with you how I set all of these up for street photography. So without any further delay, let's get started. In aperture priority, we can choose to set the ISO value ourselves or use auto ISO. I mix up using both for different scenarios, but I'd say 80% of the time I'm using auto ISO. When I'm using auto ISO, my general rule of thumb is if it's the middle of the day, it's nice clear skies, my minimum ISO will be set at 100 and my maximum at 800. If it's overcast or rainy, I bump that maximum 800 up to 1600. When the sun is set and I'm shooting at night, this is still an area that I'll sometimes jump into a full manual mode because the lighting conditions can be a little bit more tricky for the camera to handle. However, if I am using aperture priority, my minimum ISO will be set at 500 and my maximum at 8,000. This is a general rule of thumb that works for me, and that's because I know my cameras can handle shooting with these higher ISOs without impacting the overall image quality. Your camera's performance may vary depending on what you're shooting on, so what I'd recommend doing is conducting some ISO tests to see what your camera's threshold is like at handling those higher ISO numbers, so you can see how far you can push it. For the 20% of time that I'm not using auto ISO, I wouldn't actually set my ISO at the minimum of 100, rather I'd probably set it at 320, 640, 800, or maybe even higher depending on the lighting situation. And the reason I take this approach for both auto and manual ISO is to avoid compromising my shutter speed. When you are in auto ISO, the camera will sometimes set the ISO value to 100, and whilst in theory that's great, in practice that can actually compromise your shutter speed. The problem is that your camera in some shooting scenarios is going to bring down the shutter speed to such a slower value that it runs the risk of introducing shake and blur to your photograph. Now, we don't want this, so what you can always do is set your ISO yourself, or a neat little trick is to set your minimum ISO with auto ISO to a higher value. But my preferred approach is using auto ISO in conjunction with a minimum shutter speed. Minimum shutter speed is something that has completely changed my approach to street photography. It is a hack and it is a game changer. And I've been doing photography for years and I didn't know this was a thing. How? I honestly don't know. I must have been living under a rock. It's available on most modern cameras. You might just need to hunt for it a little bit in the menus, especially if you're a Sony user. That thing is buried in there like it's hidden treasure. So basically, for those unfamiliar, a minimum shutter speed is basically you saying to the camera, oi, listen up. No matter what you do not shoot below this shutter speed. So when you're using this in conjunction with auto ISO, the camera is going to adjust those parameters the best it can to meet in line with the rule you have just set. It is a powerful setting. So for me, I've got my minimum shutter speed set at 1/250th of a second. Generally, if you want to freeze movement, 1/250th of a second is enough for street photography. When I'm shooting at night, I may bring my shutter speed down to 1/25th of a second, but this all depends on what subject you are shooting and how fast things are moving in your frame. Do you have image stabilization in your camera or lens? And it depends on what focal length you are shooting with. When you are shooting an aperture priority, the most important decision you can make is what aperture value do you choose? As I mentioned earlier, aperture has the biggest scope in dictating the final look of our image. So for me, I try and use an aperture that best works for the scene I'm trying to capture. So that be wide open at f1.4 to have beautiful blurred backgrounds and draw focus to a specific detail or subject in the frame, or more narrow per se at f11 to have more things in focus. It really just depends on the scene and what I'm trying to capture. Throughout this year in particular, I have been experimenting a lot more with different aperture values to see what best works for me when it comes to street photography. And from this, I have found a good sweet spot is f4 to f5.6, with f4 being my base aperture, and I think this is actually a common go-to for a lot of street photographers. My camera will often be set to this when I'm roaming around the streets because I can quickly adjust it up or down if I need to. f4 I find also provides a good balance of in and out of focus elements. It creates a bit of depth, but at the same time not too much, where elements are completely blurred out and you lose all sense of context. I find shooting at these values for street photography can also allow for slight misses in your autofocus, which can be useful in those fast-paced scenarios. Now moving on to wider apertures, the apertures that you use when you just want to let your hair down and blur the absolute sugar out of everything. Typically, I will use anywhere between f1.4 to f2.8 for a few different reasons. Firstly, I fancy it because it can be a lot of fun to shoot with and you can create some really cool results. Plus, it's addicting. Secondly, and a more valid reason, is for low light shooting scenarios. At these times of day, I will need as much light entering the camera as possible so I can achieve a balanced exposure where my shutter speed is fast enough to freeze time and my ISO isn't so high that it starts making my photograph look like Swiss cheese. If it's overcast, rainy or night, these are typically the times that I will use these wider aperture numbers, but this is just a very general rule of thumb which is subject to change depending on where and when I am shooting. And thirdly, I will use it for subject separation, as this can allow me to draw focus to a specific subject or detail in the frame and make it pop against the background. And finally, let's talk about narrow aperture numbers. I typically use these in harsh lighting conditions, and I opt to use these when I want almost everything in focus from the foreground to the background, and my go-tos are anywhere between f8 to f11. f8 cuts out a lot of light and offers good depth to an image, whilst f11 offers the sharpest possible result, because as you know, lenses are typically at their sharpest at this value. At this point, we have set up our auto ISO, minimum shutter speed, and we understand a lot more about aperture values for street photography. So now would be a good time to talk about exposure compensation. For those unfamiliar, exposure compensation is a setting that allows you to adjust the exposure determined by the camera's light meter. It allows you to make the image brighter or darker than the camera's automatic exposure would suggest. This is useful if the camera's automatic exposure hasn't quite captured the scene how you'd like it to. Finding exposure compensation on your camera should be quite simple. There is often a dial for it on top of your camera. However, some cameras like my A6700 don't have this dial, and if your camera doesn't, look out for this symbol. For me, on the A6700, that can be located on the rear of the camera underneath the round dial.
You sneaky little sausage.
I'm going to share with you how I use exposure compensation for a few different shooting scenarios. However, there is a huge asterisk attached to all of these because it is so situational and light dependent. Typically, if it's a bright sunny day, I can set my exposure comp anywhere between minus 0.7 to plus 0.3. I find this works in most sunny conditions. Where this might not work is on overcast days, which we have a lot of here in the UK, unfortunately. So typically on these kind of days, I would have it set between anywhere from 0 to plus 0.7. And on the couple of occasions that I have used aperture priority for night photography, I have found that minus 1 to minus 0.3 is a pretty good place to be at, as it allows you to keep the details in bright lights, as usually they can be overexposed very easily, and it's close to impossible to bring those overexposed elements back in post. When you're shooting in aperture priority mode and you're using the exposure comp, it is important to understand how your camera is actually reading the light, and this is what we call our metering modes. Now, I've never had to adjust these in the past, as I was always shooting in manual mode, so I was controlling everything with the exposure myself, but now I'm venturing a lot more into aperture priority mode and using a lot more for street photography. I have started venturing a lot more into these and understanding how they work and which ones work best for different scenarios. Although in 95% of shooting scenarios, I do keep my camera locked in on one metering mode, and that one is called multi. I think it has different names for different camera systems, but its function is the same. It's definitely the most common metering mode, and how it works is it bases the exposure off the entire frame, and this is why it works best in most situations. On other occasions, especially when you have scenes with dramatically different bright highlights and dark shadows, this is where a center weighted metering mode can work really well. Center weighted metering, as the name suggests, zeroes in on the center of the image and bases the exposure from there. So for instance, picture this: you want to take a photograph through a window, but you also want to have the window frame in shot to create a nice frame within a frame. If you're in the wrong metering mode, the camera might expose for the window frame rather than what's outside, so you'll have a really nicely exposed window frame, but everything outside, the thing you actually want exposed correctly, is completely blown out and overexposed. But with center metering, it's the opposite. The scene outside will be exposed correctly how you want it to be, and then the window frame will naturally fall into the shadows. On rare occasions, I may use a spot metering mode, which essentially is an extreme version of center metering. The only difference is you can move it around your frame and have more control of where the light is being metered from. If you shoot with a wide focusing area, you're going to get a round circle in the middle of the frame and it's not going to move. But if you use an expandable spot or spot focusing mode, wherever you put your focusing point is where the camera is going to meter the light from. Whilst it's not something I use that often, it can be super useful for creative purposes and creating that divide between the highlights and the shadows. And there is actually one more metering mode that I almost forgot to mention, and that one is highlights. I used this one a few times when I was on a recent trip in Lisbon, and it was super handy. As the name suggests, the highlight metering mode prioritizes nothing but those highlights. So if I'm in a high contrast environment shooting towards sunset, for example, and I want to create silhouettes, or I just want to expose for the highlights, then this mode is going to be brilliant for that. Whilst I use all of these metering modes, as I said, I use multi for 95% of shooting scenarios, and I actually have a little trick that I use. Instead of constantly changing my metering mode, I just adjust my exposure compensation. So in moments when I or the scene are moving quickly, instead of jumping in the menus and fiddling around with my metering modes, I will just drop my exposure compensation, maybe to as low as -2, to achieve my desired exposure. I find this to be a much quicker method for me when shooting street photography, and it just saves me changing my settings back and forth when it comes to the metering modes and potentially missing a shot. If there is a scene where I'm fishing at a location and I've got like a composition ready to go and all I'm waiting for is a subject to walk through it, this is where I may adjust my metering modes because I will have more time to get my settings dialed in. Alright, so that is how I set up my camera in aperture priority mode for street photography. I'd like to say thank you for watching today's video, and I do hope it has been insightful and helpful. If you have any thoughts or feedback on this tutorial video, it would be great to hear in the comments below. I would like to start doing more tutorial based content like this, and also discussion based content, but of course all focused around photography. So any feedback will be welcomed and greatly appreciated. Also, in the comments, please feel free to share how you expose for street photography, as well as learning a thing or two from me. People in the comments might be able to learn something from you also. And with all that said, I'm going to get out of this office because it is a sweat box. I'm going to then go and get some lunch, and then I'm going to start editing this video. So until next time, guys, create, explore, and inspire.